Hey guys, let's talk about foot sensors. This is a long overdue video. I've been wanting to make this for a while now. Basically, we'll go through how they work and what are the key settings in VESC, and then we'll also talk about how to deal with sensors that are acting up, and we'll touch on how to tune them for racing and trick scenarios. So let's get right to it. So let's look at some key settings for your foot sensors. In refloat config specs, you will find your ADC thresholds. The default is 2 volts, and typically your sensor will be somewhere around 0 when it's off and over 3 volts when it's on. Some sensors are a little bit different, but the default threshold is 2 volts so that it sits right in between, ensuring that we detect the on state and the off state correctly. If your sensor is a little bit different, you may want to tune this in order to improve the behavior. So play around with it, monitor your actual voltages whenever you get a new sensor, and especially if it's a DIY sensor. Next, you have beep on sensor fault. In my opinion, there's no reason not to have that setting on. I have it on all my boards because it tells me when my foot comes off the sensor. Some people who do a lot of jumping and tricks, they might find this annoying because the beeping will happen pretty frequently. But I really like it because if that beep starts increasing in frequency all of a sudden, then you know that your sensor is starting to fail and you need to start looking at replacing or fixing it. Then we have some settings in the stop section. There is the ADC half state fault ERPM. It's quite a mouthful, but basically it's the speed at which we transition from requiring both sensors to be on to only requiring one sensor to be on. And typically the default is 200 ERPM or 0.4 miles an hour. Yeah, there's no good reason to change this really. Then you have your timeouts. The half switch fault delay, that is when you're below 0.4 miles an hour and you're doing your heel lift. Basically, how long does your heel need to be lifted before the board turns off? The default is 250 milliseconds, which is a little shorter than with a future motion vehicle, where I always found that you have to lift your heel pretty long before the board disengages. But this is personal preference. You can change that if you'd like. Then you have the full switch fault delay. This is how quickly the board shuts off if your foot comes off the sensor entirely when you're at any speed, basically. Default is 250 milliseconds. I typically have mine a little longer. Combined with the beep on sensor fault, I at least get a heads up if my sensor is no longer detected, because I'm paranoid about the sensor shutting off for some reason. So I like mine at around 500 milliseconds, and that way I can at least hear a beep before the board shuts me off. Then there's other settings as well. In refloat config stop, we have PAUSE, so treat both sensors as one. That essentially disables half faults. This feature only makes a difference at those low speeds, so for tricks this can be nice, but it also means you cannot do a heel lift anymore. Then there's reverse stop, aka simple stop. This was introduced as a beginner feature, but it can also be used for a ghosting sensor. More on that later. Then we have disable moving faults. This feature keeps the sensor on above 1 mile an hour when riding forward. Then in the start section, we have simple start, which is basically PAUSE, but only for the first second. So you can still do a heel lift. Then we have dirty landings. you get 1 second of 10 extra degrees of tilt margin to re-engage the board. And there's push start, where the board angle is being ignored as long as the sensors are pressed and the motor is moving. Now, if your sensor is working perfectly, you don't really need to do much with these settings, but here are some corner cases where you may want to adjust some of these settings. So let's start with a sticky sensor. How do you prevent ghosting even if you have a sticky sensor? Basically just turn on reverse stop. Why does that work? The battery in the rear makes the board always want to go backwards because it's heavier in the rear, and so the tail always tends to push down. So that slows down the board when you're going forward, and then it shoots backwards if the sensor is still detected as being on. So reverse stop prevents that.
I have enabled reverse stop, and that way, yep, I can't go in reverse. I can't do this kind of stuff. It just turns off. But at least I don't have to worry about my board ghosting. So of course now when I'm trying to demonstrate it, it doesn't ghost. But this sensor basically, especially when the weather is warmer, likes to stick, and sometimes it takes a few seconds for it to disengage. And that's why I've enabled reverse stop, and that way I don't have to worry about the board ghosting on me. Yeah, the main downside is that if you try to do tricks like skirting the board, it might disengage on you, and obviously you can't go backwards. So if you're stopped at a traffic light and you're playing around, your tail will always come down. But it's not a big problem to deal with, especially if you're doing trail rides. You can work with that for quite a bit of time. Obviously, the best solution is to fix or replace your sensor. Now, if you really like soft foot pads, there may not really be a good way to fix this, because this issue just sort of, in my experience, keeps coming back. Even if the sensor feels perfect, that doesn't mean it will stay perfect at all temperatures and at all rider weights. And so it just seems like a very, very difficult undertaking to get this sensor to be 100% reliable. And my preference for sensors is to use the wooden sensor and put a thick layer of foam or TPU, like 5 millimeters or so, to give you that soft feeling.
Now, what if we have the opposite case, where you have an unreliable sensor, where the sensor sometimes disengages out of nowhere? Here we use disable moving faults. This keeps the board engaged under any circumstance as long as you keep riding forward. But careful, this does not help in reverse, and on steep downhills your board may ghost, because if it's tilted forward far enough, then the heavier battery doesn't really help, and then the board just shoots forward at full speed. If it's a trail, most likely the board will fall over pretty quickly, but in personal experience, it can cover quite a distance downhill even if it falls over, so it turns into a rocket very quickly. Other than that, in cruising on street and flat trails, this feature is pretty safe to use. But yeah, beware of some weird corner case situations. So best thing to do whenever you have issues with a sensor is get a new one or fix the old one. Yeah, these features are good as workarounds, but they're not permanent solutions.
One of the key steps for troubleshooting your sensors is to diagnose them. And we've got all the tools you need. You've got floaty, you've got float control, So that's what you should be using to actually determine what's going on with your sensor. You can use that. So here, let me give you an example. And actually even VESC tool in the app UI gives you your sensor information. In float control, in the top left and top right, you can see your sensor values. And if the sensor turns off, it will turn to yellow. So if I lift my heel while riding, you'll see the yellow come up. And that's how you know that the sensor has gone past its threshold, meaning it is considered off by the firmware. But obviously right now, because I'm riding above 0.5 miles an hour, the board keeps riding even though one sensor is off. Yeah, and then another thing you have in, if you go into the menu and more, there is show live charts, and then you press on the blue motor current down there and you do ADC sensor voltages. So now you can see live how your sensor is acting. So if your sensor values look like this, even though you're riding straight and not moving your foot, then you know that your sensor is pretty shitty and probably needs to be replaced. So then the other thing is, let's say you were riding and you had a nosedive and you don't know why. Look at your logs. Your logs in floaty and float control include the ADC values. So if you see that you were still riding at speed and then both of your ADC values went below the threshold, then you know that your nosedive was purely due to a sensor malfunction or maybe your foot placement, but that way at least you know what happened, right? And you don't replace a sensor even though you have potentially other issues. Obviously, it doesn't always have to be the sensor when the ADC values go low. It could be that you have a loose wire inside the controller box, which means that the signal gets interrupted and you also get your values going to zero if you have a loose wire, right? So that's an option as well. So make sure that you don't just blindly replace your sensor and assume that everything is fine inside the controller box. But yeah, this kind of data is super helpful. So there's even a page on the Float Control Watch app you can go to focus just on your ADC values if you're uncertain and you don't want to get your phone out. And since I'm already talking about float control features, if you long press either of the sensors, you get quick access to the different settings. So if you temporarily want to turn on reverse stop or disable moving faults or any of these, you can just do it straight from here while riding. So for example, if I want to pause my sensors, I can do that right now. And then once I'm at pause speed, it will tell me in the sensors up above that that feature is on. Yeah, so you can quickly play with these features and enable them as needed, even just temporarily.
Now, what if you have a dead sensor or no sensor at all, and how do you ride without one? This is not meant to be a guide for riding without a sensor, but more of how do you get home if your sensor dies mid-ride. All you need to do is you set your ADC threshold to 0 volts, and very important, also turn on reverse stop. So that way you can engage the board super easily. Basically, as soon as you level it out, the board will be on, and the reverse stop makes sure that your board doesn't ghost. But again, be careful, the board will now engage as soon as you level it out. So that can have quite some side effects that you don't anticipate. Be very, very careful with this. Also, don't forget to turn it off before loading it in your car. The last reason you want to tweak these settings is for racing or doing some tricks. So how do you make sure that your board keeps riding in extreme situations? First, you want to turn on dirty landings. If you do a big jump, no matter how you make your settings, the board is likely to disengage mid-air, and when you land, it's important that your board is able to quickly re-engage so you don't nosedive. Push start is another feature that helps. So if you land in a way where normal engagement isn't possible, then if the motor is turning at least, and the fact that your foot is on the sensor, the board will turn on again. Optional, you can extend the full fault delay to keep the board engaged longer when you do big jumps. You can turn on disable moving faults as long as you keep in mind the risks that you're taking. And last not least, turning on posi for racing is pretty pointless unless you race at super slow speeds. Because posi, basically the board is always, by default, every board is posied above a mile an hour. So the posi feature is mainly for doing tricks at very low speeds, or if you keep changing directions, then you temporarily go below 0.5 miles an hour, and at that point you want to make sure that only one sensor is required to keep the board on. That's what posi does, but for normal racing it doesn't really make any difference.
All right, I hope this has been helpful. See you guys next time.